Hi, welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and start our webinar today on social work, critical feminisms, and sex work. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Mimi Kim, and I'm a co-editor-in-chief of Affilia, Feminist Inquiry and Social Work. I welcome all of you as I introduce the second in what we hope is an ongoing webinar series, Engaging Critical Feminisms. Please be aware that this webinar features closed captions, which you can access by clicking on the live transcription bar at the top of your screen. Another way to access this is to click on More, which shows up at the bottom right of your screen, and you can choose the live transcription option. A recording will also be available on the Affilia YouTube channel, and we'll give you a link today at the top of this hour, and again, a reminder at the end of our webinar today. For those of you who have questions, as you can see in the chat, please make use of the Q&A feature. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and I want to begin by acknowledging our two other co-editors-in-chief, Sarah Goodkind and Jen Zelnick, our fabulous editorial board, which really puts is a working board, puts the word work at the center of all of our activities. And Sam Harrell, who is our multi-talented and super-powered editorial assistant, who really first initiated the idea of this webinar series, and the first one that you may have caught 3 months ago. And in true Sam Harrell fashion, is also serving as our webinar technician today. I also want to thank my own institution, California State University, Long Beach School of Social Work, for co-sponsoring today's program. As many of you may know, we at Affilia have recently changed our name to Affilia, Feminist Inquiry and Social Work. We did that in order to emphasize our commitment to critical feminist theory, empirical research, and teaching. We are building on the work of our prior leaders and contributors, including Dr. Stéphanie Wahab, who is our former co-editor-in-chief, who's a professor of social work at Portland State University. And as many of you know, who's a brilliant critical feminist scholar whose contributions include her own groundbreaking work in the area of sex work and the sex trades. And we're really fortunate today to have Dr. Wahab as our moderator. Our webinar series has been imagined as a space to expand public discourse on critical feminisms within the field of social work, one that I think you will agree has historically sidelined or dismissed feminist perspectives and contributions. Those days, I would say, are numbered, and for many of us simply never warranted our concern. We were too busy. We also emphasize the importance of joining broader conversations across disciplines and certainly across the academic divide. In each webinar, we hope to feature at least one author, at least one work from our most recent issue, this being our February issue, and to create a vibrant space for established and emerging scholars, people most impacted, practitioners, and social change agents, understanding these as intersecting identities. With this brief introduction, I want to turn this webinar over to you, Dr. Wahab, and to the rest of our distinguished panel. We are so pleased to have you with us today. And thank you, all of you in the audience, for also joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Welcome, everybody. That was a wonderful introduction. Thanks for the kind words. I would like to echo Dr. Kim's warm welcome and mention just what an honor it is to be here with such an esteemed group of brilliant colleagues. I also want to welcome everyone in the audience, in particular, people with lived experience of the sex trades. And I want to begin as part of just setting the stage for today by inviting us to reject any inclination to set social workers and sex workers in separate categories, right? This binary that I want to invite us to trouble. There are plenty of folks in this space and in social work who have sex trades experiences. And I really believe that unsettling some of these binaries around coercion, consent, violence, empowerment, victim and agent will help us achieve one of our goals today, which is to complicate some of the social work discourses on the sex trades. So my goal right now is just to, one, kind of set the container, the stage for the panelists, so that together we might be able to grow and help build social work's capacity for more critical, liberatory, and useful knowledge building and consequently practices with people in the sex trades. I will partly do that by offering a few working definitions that the panelists are working with. And then I want to offer just the crudest, simplest, it won't be enough, just backdrop around social work's kind of historical relationship with people in the sex trades. And then I will introduce our brilliant panelists. So I'm going to start with some terms. And if it isn't already clear to folks, issues related to the sex trades have divided feminists for decades. And one of the challenges that many of us encounter, whether it's we're doing practice or research or organizing, is the fact that there are different definitions for these issues. And these different definitions not only add to some of the tensions in our conversations, but it also renders research really challenging. What one researcher or social worker might call sex work, and another might call sex trafficking or survival sex. And I want to note, and this is really important, I think, that these differences around the definitions are not just semantic, right? It's not, just what I call potato, you call potato, but rather they're different social, moral, political, and even theoretical values and assumptions that lie at the heart of some of these different definitions. And it's also part of the reason why the feminist debates around the sex trades have often been referred to as the feminist sex wars. So I'm going to offer a few definitions. These are definitions that the panelists are working with. And I'm sharing them just so that you all in the audience have a sense of what the panelists mean when they use these terms. And I also want to note that these terms are contested and they are fluid. So our first term is simply the sex trades. And this refers to the act of trading sex or sexual services for some type of payment. This term makes no assumptions about choice, about coercion, or consent. It tends to be used as an umbrella term that includes many different forms of trading sexual services under a range of conditions, and the term itself does not invoke identity. For example, not all people who trade sexual services identify as sex workers. So that's our first term, sex trades. The next term, sex work. The term sex work was coined by Carol Lee in the 1980s. She was attending a feminist conference and she heard the term sex use industry. And so she substituted the word use with work in order to center the provider, not the client. So sex work refers to the exchange of sex or sexual services for money, drugs, housing, transportation, rent, and other material needs. The other term, sex trafficking, the definition that we are leaning on today is the one from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was signed in 2000 and has been reaffirmed, I believe, 5 times since then. And the definition there is a severe form of trafficking, commercial sex act that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. Another term that you're going to hear is carceral feminisms. Dr. Elizabeth Bernstein coined this term to describe the influences of second wave feminisms to encourage women's reliance on law enforcement for violence intervention. Another term, anti-carceral feminisms. This is a term that has been informed by the work of scholars who write a lot about prison abolition as it intersects with gender and anti-violence and anti-carceral feminist lenses. And it offers an intersectional and liberatory approach for critically exploring the sex trades in today's case. Anti-carceral feminisms illuminate the impact of police violence, for instance, during anti-trafficking stings, and it identifies alternatives to the criminal legal system like mutual aid, community accountability, a greater focus on systemic change, of course, decriminalization of illegal sex trades and drugs, harm reduction tools. And while many of us have leaned on and engaged with the term of anti-carceral feminisms, there is also a shift that's been happening to using the term abolition feminisms. And the panelists today, and we all really lean on Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie's fantastic book, Abolition Feminism. Now, if you haven't read it or heard about it, run, don't walk. And for us right now, abolition feminism, we're thinking of it as defined by these authors as political work that embraces a both and perspective that helps us move beyond binary thinking of either or logic and the shallowness of reform work. So we recognize that relationality of state and individual violence, and thus frame our resistance accordingly, supporting survivors and holding perpetrators accountable, working locally and internationally, building communities while responding to immediate needs. That's I should have noted like a quote from their text about how they're defining abolition feminism. I also want to note for some folks, in case there's some confusion in the audience, that the term abolition feminism has also been invoked and used by radical feminists in the 80s and 90s. If you think of Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, and others, whose goal was to abolish prostitution, and that anti-sex work, anti-prostitution approach also gets reference as abolition feminism, so that's a little bit confusing. And today we're largely leaning on it as Angela Davis, Beth Ritchie, and others are teaching us. So the next thing I want to do before I introduce our panelists, and I'm just going to say this is too brief, it is inadequate, it is too simple, and it's what I can provide so that we spend most of our time with our brilliant panelists. And that is just a few words about social work's historical kind of relationship and patterns of engaging with the sex trades. This is something that I've been really interested in for decades. So for starters, social workers have been engaged with people who trade sex or sexual services for long before the profession was even recognized as a profession. Influenced by the notion of prostitution as a form of sexual slavery. In her new book, or the book of 1912 was published, titled A New Consciousness and an Ancient Evil, Jane Addams referred to prostitutes as victims of white slavery who needed to be rescued from immoral people and forces. And while Jane Addams wrote passionately about prostitution as a social evil, there were evangelical moral reform workers before her who were hard at work rescuing women from depraved men, poverty, moral ills, and illegitimacy. That was a big term for these workers back then that was used to refer to out of wedlock births. And these same social workers even though they weren't called social workers at the time, were also engaged in institutionalizing women who had either fallen from virtue, right? That was the language, the terms they were using, or were considered feeble-minded. And feeble-mindedness was believed to be an outcome of sexual promiscuity. So it's been my assessment kind of over decades of doing a lot of this kind of work and research that social work involvement with the sex trades and people in the sex trades tends to demonstrate the extent to which social work practices reflect broader, larger social values and beliefs, which makes sense. I've had the benefit of being taught and guided about the sex trades by those with lived experience over decades. I've been involved in research and practice and policy work in the US around sex trades issue, as well as in New Zealand. And for those of you who don't know, New Zealand was the first country to decriminalize prostitution, sex work in 2003. And perhaps what's relevant to today's panel is that I've also been involved in writing two of National Association Social Work's policy statements on sex trades. One was in the early 90s and one was just a couple of years ago. So I can say, I feel like I can confidently say that social work's not only kind of deeply divided around all of these issues, but also that social work has generally aligned itself with those who view sex work, sex trades as a form of violence, and who favor abolishing sex work altogether. And so I'm framing today by highlighting the fact that social workers have a long, and I would say some like pretty troubled history with individuals engaged in the sex trades. Whether we were institutionalizing women who had fallen from virtue in the late 1800s, removing their kids through the child welfare system in the 80s and the 90s, or having police handcuff perceived victims of sex trafficking in order to offer them diversion services under duress in the early 2010s, we social workers have given people in the sex trades plenty of reasons not to trust us. Social work initiatives like the now defunct Project Rose, started by Dr. Rose Sepowitz at the Arizona State University School of Social Work, provides a really useful and I would say terrifying example of rescue-based social work that is both oppressive and deeply carceral in nature. Dr. Meg Panichelli and I published a piece on Project Rose in this journal many years ago to highlight some of the violence and the harms of carceral, not just logics, but interventions when it comes to the lives of people in the sex industry. So now the fun part, I want to introduce our panel today. And I will start with Dr. Sharvari Karindikar. She, her pronouns. She began her career practicing as a social worker for sex workers and victims of sex trafficking in Mumbai, India. During her Ph.D. program in social work at the University of Utah, where I got my Ph.D., and through her work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, and later at the Ohio State University, she's focused her research efforts on issues related to female sex workers and victims of sex trafficking, particularly on gender-based violence, health, mental health. Dr. Karindikar's current research relates to sex work and sex trafficking in Asia, egg donation, international gestational surrogacy, medical tourism, and its impact on women. And Affilia has published, and we want to highlight one of her recent articles titled, "I am almost a breadwinner for my family, exploring the manifestations of agency in sex workers, personal and professional contexts." Our second panelist, Dr. Sunny Sinha, she, her pronouns. Her research and scholarship has covered a wide range of global issues, including HIV/AIDS prevention, sex work, human trafficking, violence against women. She has considerable social work practice and research experience working with diverse groups of sex workers and different local non-governmental agencies reaching out to sex worker communities in Kolkata, India. Before joining Marywood University in 2012, where she is now, she worked as an adjunct faculty for 5 years at the University of South Carolina, Columbia. And she has a number of brilliant articles, and one of them published that we'd like to highlight in Affilia is titled Flying Female Sex Workers in Kolkata, India, Using Cultural Biography to Understand HIV Risk Perception. And last but not least, I want to introduce Dr. Alexandra Lutnick, she, they, y'all pronouns, is a social scientist whose work focuses on people engaged in sex work, people experiencing trafficking, as well as assisting agencies with program evaluation. Alex's work is grounded in harm reduction and strives to always engage community members in the process of knowledge production. Dr. Lutnick provides consultation services to nonprofit, governmental, and research organizations, and she's a lecturer in the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley. And her book that I recommend to anyone doing work that engages with sex trafficking was titled Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking Beyond Victims and Villains, was published in 2016 by Columbia University. So welcome all, welcome our panelists. Now we get to the fun part. We have 3 questions. I will pose them to panelists to answer, and then we will invite the audience to ask questions based on their presentations when they are done. So for now, I would like to invite the panelists to each in a very brief kind of moment, if you could share with us how you came to this work. And maybe to save time, I'll just call on folks if that makes sense, and I'll try and rotate who goes first. How about Dr. Karindikar? Would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. It's a real privilege to be among our expert panelists, Sunny and Alex. And it's so wonderful to be in the company of Stephanie and Mimi and Sam and all of you amazing Affilia folks. I really admire you a lot. You heard a little bit about me already. My name is Sharvari. I'm originally from Mumbai, India, and that's where I got my bachelor's degree in psychology and my master's degree in social work. And as the first job out of college, I started working at a nonprofit organization called Committed Communities Development Trust. And what we did was that we had a small drop-in center in the middle of a brothel district in Mumbai called Kamathipura, where it was open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And I had the key because I was the center-based social worker. So I would open the center at 9 a.m. and we had about 50 sex workers who would come and spend the day with us. And we did several activities. We did health education. We provided care and support to women who were HIV infected, affected. We talked about nutrition. We went out in the community, promoted condom use. So it was a life-changing job for me over the years. Now, this was in 2004, so it's been almost 17 years now. But female sex workers and their lives have inspired me, and their strength and determination continue to motivate me to engage with this community. So that is who I am. And thank you so much for inviting me for this.
Thank you so much. How about Dr. Lutnick? What brought you to this work?
Thank you, Dr. Wahab. Just to echo Sharvari's just words of gratitude. It's really a pleasure to be here with each of the panelists and with Mimi and Sam. And thank you to all of those who are tuning in as this is being recorded and those who will be watching. Back in 2001, I started working for the St. James Infirmary, which is a peer-run occupational health and safety clinic for people engaged in sex work. And I was doing harm reduction services, HIV and STI testing, street outreach, needle exchange. And what I realized pretty quickly as a new organization at that point, the clinic was about 2 years old, we weren't doing the best job of capturing data that we could use to advocate for meaningful changes for people based on their lived experiences. And that set the trajectory for me. So I have my own lived experiences in the sex trades. I was involved in sex work on and off throughout my 20s. And being able to do participatory based research, which is really my passion, meaning that folks with lived experiences are involved in as many stages of the research process as possible. To me, hopefully it's all of the stages. To me is how we affirm the rights of people and the diversity of people, right? Recognizing through my work at St. James, even though I have my own lived experience, that's mine. And there's other aspects of my identity that are quite different from other folks. And so I really strive in my work to incorporate folks along that spectrum of choice, circumstances, and coercion. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Dr. Sinha, how about you? How did you come to this work? I think you're still muted. So I think you're still muted. Yeah, there we go. Yep.
So good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I echo Sharvari and Alex, your statements about feeling very excited, and as well as I'm already learning quite a bit, just the exchange of conversations that have happened throughout the planning of this webinar. So, to just answer your question about how I came to closely work with on the issues of sex work and become familiar with the lives of women, diverse groups of sex workers actually in India. So I'm actually native of Kolkata, and Kolkata is also a place for sex workers' rights movement. And so I think despite the, so that was one thing that I've now been there. And then I also started working as a project manager of an HIV prevention project, which was a government-funded sexual health outreach project, reaching out to street-based sex workers, unlike the brothel-based organizing movement that happened. So I think I would say that there is a lot of diversity within sex work and how they want to be viewed and what their views are. And that's something I became very much familiar with. Just paying attention to their voices, because I'd gone in there with a very rescue and a rehabilitative approach. I mean, I didn't realize how much of an unlearning I had to do before I could start providing the services, because each time it were those biases that came in terms of finding a different job when people said what job you could provide me which will be free from sexual harassment or sexual requests. So, that got really thinking, because this was said to be by a woman who said, tell me which job you'll give me that won't ask me for a sexual favor. So it actually started to make me think about the compare sex work with other occupations and what has there been their previous experiences. And those were the insights that actually, beginning insights that got me, like you said, for my doctoral dissertation study, and also to use a methodology that would capture the voices rather than the standard methods that people were going in and researching the group with. So I'd probably say that is how I started off, and I am still continuing to participate actively in the movements and the research work that I continue to with transgender people in India right now, and also in the US. Yes, so that will be it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'll pose my first, or I guess second question to the panel, and just so you can prepare yourself, I was thinking of asking Sunny to speak first, Sharvari, and then Alex. And the question is, can you tell us a little bit about your work, and particularly focus on what you see as a major contribution or even interruption to social work's relationship to the sex trades? So, Sunny, do you mind going first?
No, I'm fine with that. So yeah, I mean, just to tell you, I've already said that my practice experience for 2 years managing this project was really instrumental in sort of, thinking about that, how is this risk discourse being formulated, and the problematics of that, because it was mostly seen as an HIV/AIDS, and that's how these groups became visible in India. I mean, until then, there were no HIV prevention program. There were no social welfare programs for sex workers. So if I have to say that one of the major contributions or interruptions that my work has made in social work's relationship to sex work would be basically, the paper that I've written about is the methodology piece. And I've used cultural biography as a method, which is a anthropological method. The groundwork for this method was laid in the field of disability studies by Jelia Frank. It's called Venus on Wheels. And that method actually is a combination of participant observation and life history. So what I did was, and the reason why I use that, because there were several issues when it comes to researching sex workers as an outsider. And to briefly mention some of these issues were in just the trust and rapport with them. The responses that I gathered in the field were just performing that victim narrative as well, because it was just rehearsed and said again and again. So I spent 6 months in the field, visiting the solicitation sites, and also women wanted to see how much of they could trust me. So they asked me to come over to the brothels and take the interviews there. And it was quite, an unlearning process for me, as how much people also, like how much of the media narrative about the danger and this is there and that was there as I was entering these brothels while collecting. And I would come back and then people would say, nothing happened to you, or, how come you're safe? You're all good. So I think my contribution would be in terms of, just drawing awareness about how one can gain access to some of these hidden transcripts. This is a term that I use from James Scott, again, an anthropologist, Domination and the Arts of Resistance, in his book. And he says, basically says, the discourse that takes place off stage beyond direct observations of power holders. And I think that is what I've written about in my article, the ethical and safety issues in doing sex work research. And the reason I wrote was, I think we pay attention to the findings, we don't pay attention to the process of doing research. And I think it is very pertinent to social sex work research that we highlight the process, because it has the potential for, the authenticity of the data and so forth. So that's one of the contributions. And also, like I said, the privileging the voices and the marginalized perspectives of sex workers is something that I've done through the article that is featured in Affilia. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sharvari, do you want to go next and talk about what you see as some of your main contributions and or interruptions?
Sure, thank you. I'll start with talking a little bit more about the work I have done with female sex workers. In Kamatipura in specific, I have really been very devoted to this particular area, because also I don't live very far from where this is in Mumbai, and really continue to establish connections with sex workers there, as well as various nonprofits that are there, volunteering with them. and particularly, and thankfully in 2019, I got to spend a whole year living in India on a sabbatical, and then really pursuing that kind of social work practice again, which I missed being in academia for so long. But anyway, so my work does focus on female sex workers in Kamathipura. It really revolves around exploring lived experiences of sex workers, understanding their needs and challenges in their day-to-day lives, and in doing so, advocating for sex workers' rights and decriminalization of sex work. So all the papers that have come from the various small projects that we have done in this area really talk about the need to decriminalize sex work, really talk about how do we make this a safer environment so that women can live there with their families and children, because they do, that is where their home is. I have most recently explored sex workers' lived realities as mothers, and that was a very important research for me. We did a study to look at not just maternal health, but breastfeeding, infant feeding practices, breast milk sharing practices in the community, which I thought was really interesting to note given the relationships that women have with each other. That was a really exciting sort of a project, but also looking at sex workers as breadwinners, as women who exercise agency, assert their roles within their families and communities. For the purpose of this webinar, I think the paper that is highlighted started off as this project we were doing in 2019 during my sabbatical year to really understand how women utilize the income that they generated. It was about understanding how that income was earned, how much was saved, how the transfers were done, and so on. What indeed we found out was that it was not just that. Women really fought for themselves and their families to put their needs first. They made sure that they took the critical decisions on how much income they used for themselves and their families, how much money they decided to send home, because most of them supported their extended families, their brothers and sisters and in-laws and a lot of family members who lived in their native villages. So they sent money home on a regular basis, prioritizing themselves as well as their children. And that was a really exciting contribution, I think, where sex workers talked repeatedly about being breadwinners and sole breadwinners in their own context. In conclusion, kind of my work really draws attention to sex workers' voices, respecting diversity of experiences among sex workers, diversity in their situations, in their evolving transitions in their lives. And I think most importantly, sort of really advocating for rights. So these women in sex work as well as self-determination, right to self-determination is something that I try to draw on. One of the things is that I have really focused on looking at cisgender female sex workers. That has been the population that I have worked with, not to say that, even in Kamathipura and world over, we do have male and trans sex workers, and again, diversity of experiences that sex workers have. In terms of major contribution, I think my work is really a drop in the ocean in terms of all the hard work that has been done by sex workers themselves in India. Like Dr. Sinha talked about the incredible work that happens in Kolkata, but also sex workers' rights activists all over India and world over who fight this fight on a daily basis. So this is really a small sort of a contribution, I would say, that I have. The other thing is that I do acknowledge that I am standing on the shoulders of giants when I talk about social work contributions towards sex work in India, right? So I have followed for years the work of Dr. Panchan Deswaran, who is at Adelphi, or Dr. Sinha, who's one of our panelists here, or Dr. Azhar and Dr. Ghosh or Dr. Das Gupta. And these are social work scholars who have repeatedly written about sex workers' rights and decriminalization of sex work. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Alex, would you like to answer next?
Sure, thank you. That's such a treat to listen to everybody. So, I'm not sure if it's a major contribution. maybe it's an interruption or another interruption among a long legacy of interruptions. And one of the things that I really strive to do in my work, and my work, just to take a step back, is with people of all genders involved in sex trades or sex work. It includes people who are experiencing trafficking. It's also with all ages. So I do work with young people under the age of 18, and I work with adults. And I think that's maybe somewhat unique. And my work is predominantly based in the US, so different than the other two panelists. But what I try to do in all of my work is remind the field and practitioners and academics and policymakers about the heterogeneity of this very large community. And I think Dr. Wahab, you did a great job at the beginning saying we use these terms, but they're not necessarily terms that are always used by people with lived experiences, or the terms shift for people with lived experiences based on the context in which they are. And so I think it's helpful to have terms, but also to know if I use the term sex work or sex trades, that actually doesn't tell people anything about what someone is experiencing and what the dynamics are, and if there's choice or coercion, if there's a third party, if there's somebody exploiting them. And so pointing to those nuances is what I really try to do in my work. And the reason why is, for most of us, and Dr. Sinha, I appreciate you naming early, like, oh, there was this unlearning process. There's so many preconceived ideas that people have when they hear certain terms. And so with my work, I really want to minimize the ways in which programs and policies and systems create unintended consequences and harm for people who are engaged in sex work, who are engaged in sex trades, and or those who are being trafficked. So I think to do that, and this is what I incorporate a lot in the work I do, is to not just look at this as an individual level issue, which at times with the history that Dr. Wahab provided, it's a psychological issue for people, or we have to save them, right? But instead use an ecological model where we're positioning people within the micro, macro, and meso level factors that are shaping their opportunities and constraints. And I think similarly to Dr. Karandikar, I don't feel like some of the things that I do are particularly unique. But I do suppose another contribution is that the work that I do is participatory. And I'm somebody who has made the choice as an academic and as a researcher to also name that I have lived experience. And I realize there's lots of people who are doing this work who have lived experience who don't have the ability to name that. And there's lots of reasons for that we probably need a whole separate webinar for. So I don't want to position myself as, oh, I'm someone with lived experience and a researcher, and that's a major contribution, because I know it's not just me. But by doing participatory work, it means that people with lived experiences are involved in all aspects of the project. And knowing the diversity of experiences, what I strive to do is to have folks who have chosen to do the work, those who are involved because of circumstances, and those who have experienced coercion and or trafficking. And that, unfortunately, I think is unique because there's this presentation within academia and mainstream media and advocacy, many advocacy circles, of this false dichotomy of you're a sex worker or you're a trafficking victim. And as Dr. Wahab named earlier, for many people, none of this is identity-based, it's behavior. And people move in and out of different types of experiences with sex trades. So there are people who have experienced trafficking, who then at different points go on to do consensual sex work, and vice versa. And to have that diversity of experiences, I think better equips us to strive to make sure the community's needs are being represented within the project. And there's a piece, I don't think that Sam has a link to this, so I'll just name it, but it was an edited volume many years ago, Negotiating Sex Work by Dr. Shoden and Magic, where I wrote more about the methodologies from one of the participatory studies that I did. Oh, Dr. Wahab has it. Thank you. Because there's lots of strengths to doing participatory research, and there's also a lot of challenges, particularly when it's based around community members who are engaged in activities that are criminalized. And even if it's a non-criminalized form of sex trades or sex work, highly stigmatized. And then lastly, I would say a contribution would be the ways in which I'm committed to using research to support the needs of the community by uplifting a diversity of voices through the research findings, to advocate for meaningful changes, including legislative and policy efforts. And to be completely transparent, ever since I started research, I have a tense relationship with research because it has an intense resource need. It costs a lot of money to do a good research project. And so in any project I do, I'm like, is this the best use of this money? Are there ways in which we could be more directly investing into community so that maybe we don't even need to do research going forward? But what I will say is holding that tension. The other side of it is what I find fulfilling and a contribution is with participatory research, recognizing the skills and expertise of people with lived experiences and being able to hire them and doing it in a way that doesn't require a certain level of academic standing, I think is crucial. Having studies that are based on the identified needs of folks within the community is also crucial and ensures that their needs and rights are prioritized. And it's also been really affirming when I can use methodologically strong data from the various studies I've been involved with to advocate for policies and support efforts that will hopefully reduce harm for all people engaged in sex trades and hopefully improve their lived experiences. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. As I'm listening very intently to all of you, you're all making me think about the ways in which knowledge is power and how important knowledge production, right, research, or just how we know matters. And as you are all talking about your contributions, you have me reflecting on where your knowledge that you shared with us comes from. And I'm so valuing the diversity, the nuance, and the complexity that you're sharing. And I, as someone who's been interested in social work's relationship for a long time, what I'm viewing as a collective contribution, all of you, is this complicating of social work discourses around the sex trades. And I'm just so, it gives me hope for all the things that I struggle with around social work in the sex trades. You all are giving me lots to be excited about. So the third and last question, how about 15 minutes, and then we can move to questions. Maybe I'll give, I know, Alex, you haven't had a chance to go first, but I want to give you a break since you just spoke. So how about Sharbari, if you don't mind going first, then Alex, and then Sunny. And the final question is one I'm on pins and needles on, and that is, what do you think are social work's most pressing sex trades related issues? And what is one lesson that you wish all social workers received about the sex trades? So Sharbari, do you mind going first?
Sure, I think it's a really great question, and it's a very big question, I think, and I guess we have been talking about this quite a bit since the start of this webinar. I think we have indeed spoken about this, but the criminalization of sex work and the attitude of labeling and putting individuals in boxes, and that dichotomy or binaries, those are problematic. And those are reality of social work as a profession currently. And that I think is the most pressing sex trade related issue that social work has currently. One lesson I wish, and I always keep thinking about this, is that the NASW Code of Ethics explains clearly the right to self-determination. It talks about social workers, I've written it here, so I'm going to read it. Social workers respect and promote the rights of clients to self-determination. And I really think that we need to focus on sex workers' rights and sex workers' rights to self-determination as a really important, significant learning for social workers. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to give you a little more airtime, given just how important I think your work is and where you've been doing your work, do you want to share any additional words around, you said, one of the important tensions around criminalization. Do you want to share with folks how you think about that? And
for sure. social workers working with sex workers are in minority, and particularly those trying to protect the rights of sex workers, trying to advocate for safety among this population. You are really tackling issues that are related to discrimination, stigmatization, not being able to take somebody to the hospital and admit that person because there is not enough paperwork, or there is some sort of issues that they would create given the person's identity as a sex worker, or where they belong, or where they live, or not being able to open a bank account, not being able to access a ration, for example, in the context of India. And that is problematic. Those aspects of not being able to advocate for the clients who are sex workers as social workers, to me, is a problem. And I think this issue is in the minority because we see more social workers working on other aspects of this reality, for example, in anti-trafficking, in all of those other areas, but not really understanding that women who live as sex workers may have transitioned, like Alex said, from being victims of trafficking to currently living as sex workers. But this is the reality where they live. This is the reality where they are right now. How can we provide services to this population? How can we really promote their safety, their rights, and their security? So this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that I have experienced working with sex workers, and trying to sort of advocate for their rights at this community level, but also within academia, trying to make this as an argument that sex workers have rights, and we really need to focus on creating those safe spaces to be able to talk and express this in the social work profession, I think is really critical.
And if I'm understanding you correctly, then you're saying that criminalization of sex work in India is actually a barrier for folks when it comes to accessing medical care, legal supports, bank accounts, etc.
It indeed is. It indeed is. And a lot of hard work, again, has been done by the local nonprofit organizations, by social workers who are there on the field, who try to make that bridge, who try to make those services available. You have to be in the middle of that to be able to get the individual to achieve those services. Mumbai is quite different culturally than compared to other parts of the country. So there's a lot of diversity among experiences of sex workers who live in Mumbai or in the state of Maharashtra than compared to some of the other states in India where there is more activism, there is more support, there is more social work involvement. So there is that as well. So I want to acknowledge that. My focus and research really comes from specifically from the experiences of women and as they experience it in Mumbai.
Thank you so much. Alex, do you want to answer that question next? And I can repeat it if you need.
No, that's okay. There's so much to say. And just to sort of root us back into the origins of our profession, is it started with this idea of rescuing. And that's quite different than helping. So if we think about Dr. Stephen Cartman's drama triangle, where you've got victim, rescuer, perpetrator, and you very quickly can cycle through those roles. So when you think as a social worker, you're a rescuer, the person might be experiencing it as you're perpetrating harm, or perhaps they don't act the way you want them to, and then you get mad about it. So we're reminded with that sort of triangle of how easily we and our systems, be it child welfare, the criminal legal system, social work with adults, can move from that rescuer role to that of a persecutor or a perpetrator. But we really want to maintain that middle helper position. So how can we do that better? This is sort of the ask of the profession. And Dr. Krondekar, to me, it's how do we uphold and respect people's dignity and self-determination, which is written into our code of ethics. So to be able to do that, what I've learned through the work that I do, and my belief is, we have to hear and validate the voices of people engaged in sex trades and sex work, including those who are experiencing trafficking. And we need to be aware of our perspectives. We really need a reflective practice so that we know what we're bringing with us and we can leave it at the door. It would be naive to say that we're blank slates, right? Or there's objectivity. No, but to shine a light on what we think about certain things, to ensure that we're not placing our values and our perspectives and our needs onto communities and the people that we're working with. And so there's this continuum of experiences that people have, and often a continuum of experiences for even one person. And as social workers and practitioners, we want all truths and meanings to be validated and supported to avoid situations, which I've heard over the years during research, where people feel like they can only talk about the bad things that are happening because that's what people want to hear, and that's how they'll get services, and that's how they'll get help. Or that they can only talk about the good stuff, because if they mention anything that's less than good, then someone will say, see, you shouldn't be doing it, and it is harmful, and it is this. So we want, or even those situations where people have lots of other pressing issues, but they feel like all a social worker wants to talk about or explore is their involvement in sex trades or sex work. So for those of us who are doing direct service work, advocacy work, research, what this means is we have to be able to refrain from applying our systems of meaning and understanding to a person's experience. And our aim should be creating dynamics and spaces where one truth is not better than another, where people's truths are allowed to change over time. I mean, for all of us, if you think back to what you were doing 10 years ago and how you made sense of it, and with the knowledge you have now, things might have shifted. And that's fine. It can all be true at the same time. And that our goal is to meet people where they're at and avoid making judgments and assumptions about their experiences, create spaces where they feel supported, accessing the services they want. And I think, just to sort of wrap this piece up, is there have been so many presentations I've done or trainings over the years where, because I think many people have a visceral response to people trading sex, whatever the dynamics, sometimes there's a shutdown when differing perspectives are presented. And I think as practitioners, advocates, researchers, the question is, what do we do with the discomfort in our bodies when we hear something that goes against the systems of meaning we believe are true? So I see it happen in a number of ways. We blame the messenger and or disregard. This person has no idea what they're talking about. Or if it's someone with lived experience, internally we're saying we know better than they do. They just don't know yet, whatever ... Or we can use it as an invitation for curiosity and say, why is this making me uncomfortable? What would it mean for me if what is being said is true? Am I willing to consider that possibility? If not, why? And how would this lens change my understanding of this issue and help me see the unexamined assumptions I've been making? Because I really feel until, as professionals, we can look at our unexamined assumptions, we're just going to see the cycle that has been playing out for many decades within social work continue.
Thanks, Alex. Definitely, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And on the hopeful side of things, I do have hope and have seen and am seeing shifts in social work. Sunny, do you want to answer the question, and would you like me to repeat it?
No, I got the question, and I was
Great.
listening to the speakers earlier, both Charvari and Alex, intently. You've already covered quite a bit, and I would say that really, Alex, the point about examining your biases and assumptions that you bring to it, and the preconceived notions as researchers, outsiders to the trade, especially outsiders, I think that really needs to be tackled. And to respond, I mean, one thing as I've got to change my thinking about as you spoke is, I think I'm writing, I've worked with 3 life history informants, and I collected that data in 2010 in Kolkata, India. And I reestablished contact with the 2 of the life history informants now. And it's just, I in my mind, thought that things might not go well because one was HIV positive back then, and the other was, she was a widow. And when I met and interacted with them again, it was just amazing how they have been able to resist some of the, and have their own ways of for solving the problems, and reach a point where we're still having conversations and exchange ties with them, you know. So one of the issues that, as I was writing about this, is I would like to point out is this internalized external whorephobia is already there with the criminalization, Trevor, you talked about, but this internalized whorephobia, also referred in the literature as whore stigma, it just does not affect sex workers, it affects women too, everyone. And I think that's the key point that I have took away, how when I was doing research and how people tend to control your sexuality, come back soon, they will do this to you, or those kinds of negative biases that existed. You know, it's defined by Peterson. I've drawn her work a lot. Again, she talks about whorephobia as a social and legal branding of women who are suspected of being or acting like prostitutes. And as a result, Goffman talks about is that as a female researcher studying sex work, I too was met with courtesy stigma, that is stigma by association. And so I would just, this is a quote, I didn't realize that as I was doing this study, but this quote from one of my key informant who I met in 2010 shows how whorephobia manifests in society and it affects everyone. She says, it doesn't matter what you do, Didi, which is sister, this society can never accept this, which is sex work. You tell me, when you get married, will your husband tolerate you going out and spending time with us? Society thinks we are bad women, and by mingling with us, you're just ruining your life, by which she means you might hurt your marriage prospects. Why are you wasting your time doing this research? Unnecessarily, you're jeopardizing your own safety and reputation. Nobody will listen to our stories. Even if they do, they cannot do anything about it. And so it impacts sex workers as well, but she's also trying to caution me about the repercussions that this I might face, and the stigma that I might have to go through if anything untoward happened to me. So I would say that that is one of the biggest issues that researchers, we need to see that how it's internalized in us. And to respond to what I would like, one thing that I would like social workers, you know, to know about sex work is going back to when we were doing this terminologies and stuff. I would say that pay attention to the language and the words you use and how you write about them, even in the representing them in the textbooks. These goes a long way, you know, in terms of ensuring dignity, respect for the communities that we work with. So I think I'll leave it at that. And, you know, unless you have any questions. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. My mind is racing and I'm wanting to be in conversation with all of you. Maybe we'll have time for you all to ask each other questions. For now, how about I offer some questions from the audience. Got about 20 minutes for question and answers, and there's some really wonderful, provocative and interesting questions, and we're not going to get to all of them. And I'll pose the first one here, and I'll just invite you to take turns, whoever wants to answer it. Thank you for the amazing discussion based on your rich social work research and practice. To the panel, what is your opinion regarding using person-first language? For example, people who engage in sex work or sex trades as opposed to sex workers. In public health, especially in HIV research, the term female sex work is ubiquitous. Given the fact that sex work is only one identity of many, how should we think about the issue in our social work research and practice? I'll just invite you to unmute and just answer as you want.
I love that question. I mean, I hope throughout my remarks, people noted, I default to the people first language, just because I know for many folks, they don't use identity terms and or don't want other people to use that for them. There's sort of degrees of comfort, and that people are more than one thing. I'm more than a social scientist. And I think what happens, unfortunately, with some journals is based on word counts. It's more concise to have the acronym FSW. And, you know, we see over the years the ways in which various terms have been used to describe either the behaviors or the people. And it feels as if at least certain fields are moving more towards a person first approach. And I think that's crucial because it doesn't bring assumptions with it. So this is just one thing that's going on, and if it's relevant, we can learn more about it.
I'd say I agree with Alex on that. And that question is really beautiful because I find myself, and I also think women engaged in sex work, particularly if a person doesn't identify as a sex worker. So I'm doing a lot of writing these days. And so, you know, I have find myself wondering, should I be doing women? And that's exactly, I would say that it would be best if we keep people first language. Yes, yeah.
And I cannot agree more with Alex and Sunny, and the question is beautiful. And again, like both of you said, I think people engaged in sex work is preferred. I've also always, while doing interviews, really asked women, what do you want me to say? How would you like to be referred? And throughout scholarship, if you notice, there is a shift from time to time between how you want to be called, and it changes. You know, it can change on a day-to-day basis. It could change from periodically as well. So I do acknowledge that as well. Another critical thing is really to say, well, cisgender female sex workers is it those sort of identity related information. I think it's important to include those details. And looking at my own work, I critique myself and saying, oh, I did not clarify this. I did not clarify this. And that could be something that, is things to learn.
Thank you all. There are some delicious questions in here, and I'm going to ask one that I'm super curious about what you all think. And that is, can you address the growing trend of trauma-oriented social work with people in the sex trades? How do you see it? Anyone?
I'm happy to answer, but I know I went first the last time, so either of you would like to respond first.
Well, I just add some thoughts because I'm still thinking about that question, but I would say that, I think it's important because of depending on the woman, if you're working in a criminalized and particularly stigmatized environment, I think you need to have a trauma-informed lens to be able to escalate any traumas that people might have experienced. So that's, I think if that's what the question was about.
Thanks, Sunny. Alex, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I have a troubled relationship with that term. And in part, what I've heard from people with lived experiences is the ways in which they feel like it reduces them to the bad things that have happened in their lives, and that they're more than just that. So it comes at the work with a very particular lens of you've been traumatized. At the same time, some people have experienced significant trauma. And if folks have gone through a robust, thorough social work training, how is that different than trauma informed? Like, that should be woven in regardless. And I think what happens, I mean, I still feel new to this work, even though I've been doing it for 2 decades, but in the 2 decades, you see certain terms pop up and they become buzz terms. And without looking into it, and here's the researcher in me, we don't know what that actually means in terms of how it's being applied. So you could have a program that's really great and trauma informed, and they build themselves that way, and they do meet people where they're at, and they honor people's self-determination, and they don't have a preconceived idea of what someone should or should not be doing. And then you could have programs like Project Rose, which I'm sure would bill themselves as trauma informed, that have created trauma. The other tension I have with it is it focuses so much on the person and doesn't look at the ways that systems create harm. And so that's where it's like, oh, I need to know more about how it's being used and in what context to be able to offer opinion, because it's almost like saying the term sex work. I don't know. What does that mean, right? What does trauma informed mean? And how is it being assessed? And what input are they getting from clients about how they're perceiving the services or that particular style?
Do you have anything to add, Sharvari?
Just the only, and I really love that answer a lot. I think the diversity among sex trade is really striking. The experiences of individuals are quite different, and therefore to kind of call attention to one approach, for in this case, trauma informed, would not be helpful, given that we need to understand that there are different experiences that individuals who are involved in sex trade experience, and that are individual experiences that are systemic. Sometimes those are interpersonal experiences, and not, you cannot perhaps go with the assumption that any form of trauma informed would be a proper way to approach. And the question is about sex trade, so all aspects of that.
Thanks, everybody. Go ahead,
Sure.
Sunny.
I just wanted to add to that, because having I teach a course in trauma informed practice, and social work, and I think that the focus is just not on trauma; it's also on post-traumatic growth. And so, what is it that people did after doing? How did you recover? So I think that lens of strengths-based and resiliency is key when we use that term. So I would say that there is, depending on how people are using that trauma-informed practice, I think it's just not focused on trauma, but more on the resiliency of people as well. That is something I just wanted to specify. Yeah, that's a terminology that needed a definition, sure.
Thank you. There's a question here that invokes decriminalization, and I think there's a few questions that touch on it. So the question is, what are your thoughts about people that push full decriminalization, which essentially will negatively impact the population disproportionately impacted by sexual exploitation? There's a follow-up question, but I think I'll just stick with that one. So what are your thoughts about decriminalization and the fact, or I guess an assumption, that it will disproportionately impact folks who've been sexually exploited? I'll share one thing, and New Zealand, right, as I mentioned earlier, was the first country to decriminalize sex work in 2003. And it was a fraught battle. It was not easy legislation to pass, and it was largely sex workers and the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective that were involved in this. And there was a lot of fear at the time that decriminalizing sex work would open the floodgates for sex trafficking and violence and coercion. And research since then, that was 2003, it's been a long time, has not borne that out. So in places, I mean, we might think about looking at places that have decriminalized, have removed criminal penalties for sex work, and look at prevalence rates of violence and sex trafficking. So those are my 2 cents, and now I'd love to have the panel chime in.
Sorry, I can go first. Most of my work really recommends that decriminalization of sex work is strongly important to protect women who are involved in sex work in the context of Kamatipura in India. And I strongly suggest that because there are aspects of the sex trade that are clearly dangerous, and women would seek that kind of protection if sex work were to be decriminalized in their context. So I would love to see more research on understanding the relationship between increase, like the question says, of sexual exploitation in the context of decriminalization and so on, to see how, whether that is really true. And from what Stephanie mentioned, in New Zealand, it does seem like there is no real research that indicates that decriminalization of sex work increased instances of sex trafficking or sexual exploitation. So that should be really important. Even though in my own research, it has come up again and again from the voices of women themselves that they recommend that this should not be criminalized. It should not be criminalized.
Yeah, I would agree with Sharvari on that, because my research with adult women engaged in sex work really supports the argument for and the women themselves were like, talking about how the conflation of sex work and trafficking, because right now sex work per se is not legal, not criminalized in India. It's basically the trafficking laws. So many of the activities that sex workers engage in, or individuals engaged in sex work engage in, is criminalized, like soliciting, online, even the online posts that they make. There's increased surveillance about that. So I think we, post-pandemic, the sex worker community were adversely affected because the online spaces were being also very heavily surveilled by the government right now in India. And I think I heard how particularly, if they identified as paid sex worker or anything, then they were being shadow banned in those spaces as well. So they would be moved out of the dating sites and so forth. So we do have a lot of evidence of how it makes the trade go more underground, and they can't make any reports to the police because of the fact that the police might discriminate, saying, so, you were in sex work, so we don't need to do. So that's the thing that I've heard from my several research that I've done, or going back to the country. And even from here, one can see that, there are varied reasons why people engage in sex work. I mean, poverty is not the only reason. The one reason that I write about, which came out from the stories of women, and is that compared to other jobs, sex work paid them more and was less exploitative because they had more control over the time, and they could do the, perform the dual role of being a mother as well as a worker because the other jobs required them to be, do more than 12 hours, and also asked for sexual favors. So that was exactly the term that I've heard repeatedly from individuals about how criminalization doesn't allow them to even organize in spaces and feel safe. Because sometimes it's like, oh, I might get arrested. So they're always the discreet and the shame and is because of the fact that it's criminalized, and it really also access to justice becomes very difficult then for people. You can't go to courts, you can't go to the healthcare system as well. So those two are definitely impacting the health and the safety of women. And I would say that decriminalizing at least adult sex work would pave way for at least these exploitative circumstances, and people might help. Because I think in Kolkata, there is a self-regulatory board that they themselves make sure that minor girls are not trafficked into the sex trade. So they have their own boards to make sure the protection and those kinds of issues don't come up. So that's what I could speak to as far as my experiences on the ground has been.
I think just to add, and Dr. Sinha, thanks for bringing up the community boards. I think it's a really beautiful example of peer-led models with Sonagachi. And there was a paper published several years ago, I believe, that Dr. Jana wrote, noting the ways in which those peer-led groups were better able to identify folks who were being coerced into the sex trade than the local law enforcement was.
Yes.
And to me, that really highlights the need to have people with lived experiences involved. And, you know, all three of you and Dr. Wahab, I was hoping you would speak to the work you did with New Zealand, because I do feel if we have sort of this deep-rooted idea that sex trades in and of themselves are inherently problematic or exploitative or violent, we can seek out information that supports that. And so I really try to orient myself and root myself in methodologically sound research, and also the voices of people with lived experience being represented in that. And what I've seen, it's sort of that one thing that crosses countries. There can be lots of different cultural differences in terms of how sex trade, sex work plays out. Yet if we look at the research internationally, the ways in which criminalization increases the harms of those who are doing it by choice, circumstance, or coercion is well documented. And so, you know, some of what we've been trying to do in California, it started in San Francisco and then statewide, is saying, okay, if it might take a while to get to decriminalization, and I appreciate, you know, I haven't been able to look at all the comments or questions, but I can get a sense there's some folks who feel like decriminalization would be inherently problematic. And so I appreciate you all raising that. And yet with criminalization, I've heard time and time again from folks who are experiencing trafficking, as well as those who aren't, when something bad happens, they don't feel like they can reach out for support, because either they've been told by an exploiter the police aren't going to believe you, or they're going to arrest you, or they've had negative experiences with law enforcement. Unfortunately, sometimes law enforcement does abuse their power and perpetrate harms against people, regardless of whether they're involved choice, circumstantially, or through coercion. And so for me, I orient towards a rights-based approach. And I try to think, what are models we can look to that provide suggestions of how to ensure that people's basic human rights are met? And if we look at an occupational health and safety standard, we're not seeing the same discussion with folks who are experiencing exploitation in other labor sectors, like agriculture or hospitality or the fishing industry. We're not seeing the argument that we need to eradicate the industry. We're hearing we need to strengthen protections for workers. And I get that that can be a hard transition, because as I've learned in my research, a lot of the folks who are trading sex don't think of themselves as sex workers. And yet we can look to different systems legalized brothel system in Nevada. Definitely has its limitations beyond the scope of this webinar to go into that. Rates of violence, pretty much non-existent. And to me, that points to, oh, there's not this consistent link between sex trades and sex work and violence, that there are systems that can exist where people who are engaged in it have protections and have safety. And that's going to be extremely difficult, if not near impossible, in a criminalized system.
I want to add just one comment, and then we'll have like a lightning round 30-second response to a question and wrap it up. All of your comments and the conversations about decriminalization make me think a lot about Emi Koyama's work and her thinking in the ways that which influenced my thinking in the work of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. And while decriminalization is advocated for by so many sex worker rights groups around the world and would likely make conditions better for many, decriminalization isn't necessarily the answer, as Emi Koyama and folks from Insight. And this is a good moment to bring in abolition feminisms that call for kind of an anti-criminalization movement where people won't continue to be criminalized because of gender or sexual expression or poverty or race or national identity. So that was my contribution. There was one question I'm going to ask folks, 30 seconds, if you could answer just 30 seconds, and then we'll need to wrap it up. There's a lot of great questions. Do you have any tips for social workers in the field for interrupting and troubling dominant trafficking narratives? If you all take 30 seconds to try and answer that. Advice to
I would
social
say, be that person who's willing to question how someone knows that is true. I feel like if the more we can have dialogue about it, and the more we can discuss assumptions and offer differing perspectives, the greater likelihood there will be shifts in the field.
Sunny, were you going to speak?
Stephanie, could you repeat that? It just escaped.
Oh, sure.
my mind.
One piece of advice to social workers for interrupting troubling narratives around trafficking, sex trafficking.
Mhm.
And we can go to Sharvari if you're still thinking about it.
The one thing that comes to my mind, and for 30 seconds, would be really to listen to the voices from the community, to be true to the population that you represent and you're part of, and be passionate about the work you do. I think you would do the right thing to be able to send those messages in the correct way. And I think that would be the major way that as social workers, I think we can make a contribution towards that.
Thanks. Sunny, did you want to?
Yeah, I'd echo with what Alex just said right now about examining your, assumptions and, troubling the narrative that way, that, instead of the complexities of people's lives, how do we get to just, we just kind of simplifying it by saying, it's just trafficking and it's also not just sex workers and trafficked. It's that binary is also not there, because sex workers are also trafficked and can be trafficked, and that fluidity in time and change and all that stuff. So I would just end with that.
Thank you all so much. I want to invite Dr. Kim to come back in and help us wrap it up. And I want to invite all the audience to please read some of the work of these brilliant panelists. And just, I'm super excited and grateful for today.
Yes, thank you so much. I have to say that I have kind of a dream come true. I've been waiting for a webinar like this. I've been hoping somebody would do something, and sometimes you just have to be the ones that say it's time for us to do this. I want to really emphasize that this is not the webinar. on sex work and the sex trades within the context of social work, but this is a webinar and one that is, I think, still at this point in time, fairly rare. I just really am so pleased that we had the opportunity to really trouble the ways in which we as a field have framed and practiced our work in relationship to people that have engaged in the sex trades, understand the limitations of even that use of that language, but also to interrupt the ways in which we have participated in a really long legacy history of false binaries, dangerous binaries, and really harm. I really thank you for being part of the Affilia community that we're really continuing to try to grow. We're not at the center of critical feminisms, but we are one space that I think we want to really expand the influence of critical feminisms and really understand the centrality of critical feminisms to the important work of questioning social work, but also being part of our social work futures. So we invite you to continue being audience members, readers, contributors, and part of our expanding kind of web of activities that we want to offer to you. I also want to remind ourselves that March 16th is the anniversary, 1-year anniversary of the killings in Atlanta of 8 individuals, 6 of whom are Asian women who have been involved in massage businesses. While I'm not presuming that they are or they have been part of the sex trades, I think that we understand that our framework of looking at sex work has activated violence and has also activated a violent response to that violence. I want to turn you to the work of Red Canary Song, which is a very, very important coalition of people engaged in the massage businesses, and their stance at the time and now, as we are looking at 1 year, the 1-year anniversary, they have a website. I'm going to try to put that in. Oh, it's already there. I should have known. And that you please become familiar with their really powerful words of advocacy. They've done so much in this area, and we have a lot to be grateful for in terms of their intellectual and activist work. So I'm going to close that out here today. We do have a Critical Feminisms special interest group. If you're interested, please, should be an email that you can contact to be placed on the listserv and become part of our upcoming meetings. And look for our continued webinars and other opportunities. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you,
Thank you,
Sam.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.